What is going on, everyone? Anthony here, and welcome back to another video here on Let's Talk Resident Evil, talking some Resident Evil 9 leaks. And this is something where I would put some more faith into this because this is coming from a good source, Andy from Biohazard Declassified. You may know him in the Resident Evil space, but he's also a good friend of mine, and everybody was talking about this late last night, early this morning, so of course I wake up and I kind of missed the buzz immediately, so I'm probably the last one to make a video about this, but I digress, right? I'm basically making this for my subscribers at this point, so take that for as it is, right? So I think a lot of this stuff is, you know, pretty credible considering this is coming from playtesters who actually tested RE9. Now, they did the same thing for Resident Evil Village back then, and me and John covered it because we actually knew somebody who was a playtester that actually was very kind and gave us information. I'm going to keep him nameless for the sake of, you know, not ruining it for other potential playtests that this guy might be a part of, but you know who you are. You're a good friend of the show, and thank you for that. So that happened before, and it's not like it can't happen again, where Capcom gets a bunch of people together to play test the game, to kind of get feedback. And the fact that this is in the play test stage means that we may actually be getting this a lot sooner than we thought. Of course, 2025 seemed to be the, you know, estimated release for another Resident Evil title, so that's a good thing. That means we're going to be getting our hands on something sooner rather than later. So before I get into this, obviously, if you don't want to hear some of this stuff, you've been warned ahead of time, because this gets into decent details, actually, that we haven't gotten before. And if this is true that it's coming from a playtest, it's the closest thing we've gotten to actual real information. It kind of outweighs some leaks that we got before, so this is also something where it's like some of the stuff we got in the past may or may not have been true. But like I said, it's coming from a credible source, so let's get into this and break everything down. So the first thing is this will take 4 years after Resident Evil Village. That's where this thing's taking place. So unlike the time jump in the Shadows of Rose that everybody was scared about, this doesn't take place. This takes place before then. This is only 4 years after Resident Evil Village, which usually makes sense. A lot of times the main games take place, you know, 2 to 3 or 4 years after the last one, give or take. You know, sometimes it's a couple years, but this seems to be where this is kind of, you know, leading into the next, you know, BSAA story, and I'll get into that. Jill Valentine and Leon S. Kennedy will be the main characters. So we have two main characters for this game, if this is the case, and that's not a bad thing. I actually think Jill and Leon teaming up in a game is awesome, considering Jill is part of BSAA still, and Leon is still a DSO agent. So this is one of those things where if they're both main characters, do we play as either one of them? Is it going to be a co-op experience? Is it going to be, you know, something where we play as one character through one half of the game and then a character through the other half? I'm not sure. Hopefully it's not like how Chris got his treatment in Village, where it was like you played as him, but it was at the very end. It was very like last minute kind of effort. But that's interesting. So that does kind of go into the leaks of Jill and Leon being involved. That's been happening since the beginning of these leaks. But you know, some of it could have just been guessing because a lot of people wanted to see them team up in a game after Death Island, which we saw them finally, you know, team up together. Chris Redfield and Barry Burton will be supporting characters. So this is interesting because I think Chris Redfield should come back. I think he should be written a lot better than how he was in Village, because I feel like he was more of like a last kind of thought, like an afterthought in Village. Where having these main characters in here really does make it feel like a true sequel, in my opinion. You know, we're not following the Winters story. We're not, that's done. So the fact that I'm hearing Jill, Leon, Chris, Barry, that's awesome, because it says right here, Barry Burton will also be a supporting character. We haven't seen Barry since Revelations 2, but we know that he's still able to be on the front lines, or if he's a supporting character here, he will still be involved in some capacity. I think this is a great way to introduce our old characters and make it feel kind of like a reunion of some sort. Jill Valentine is dressed more tactically, apparently, similar to her look in Resident Evil 5 Lost in Nightmares. So very similar to her BSAA getup in Lost in Nightmares, which I was a big fan of that costume. It keeps with the blue theme and everything, and I think she looks pretty badass in her BSAA costume. It says Leon S. Kennedy is dressed similar to his look in Resident Evil Damnation. So if you look at the Damnation screenshots, you can kind of get an idea of how Leon will potentially look, which is, again, just a natural progression. It says here that Jill Valentine does look the same as she did in Death Island, where we know that her aging has slowed down. And it says, however, Leon does look much older. So picture a Damnation Leon, but just a lot more older, because, we figured out that Death Island, a lot of people were wondering, why does she still look the same as she did, all those years ago? And it wasn't a lazy design choice. It was actually part of what happened with her infection with Wesker and everything that happened with Resident Evil 5. So that goes into that. So the main plot, let's get into the plot. So those are just little bits there that are obviously, good to know if that's the case, that we get a similar Resident Evil reunion of characters, which is always good. But the main plot is Jill from BSAA and Leon from DSO, who investigate an island where the company who created Evelyn resides. So Evelyn, they are creating mass clones of Evelyn with the Megamycete. So this does still tie into Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil 8 in terms of, some of the stuff that was going on from the Megamycete, which we saw in the Ethan story. So it looks like they're trying to clone Evelyn with the Megamycete to potentially, mass spread the virus, so to speak, or if you want to call it a, infection, right? That's basically what it is. And so this is something where it's very interesting because it still references 7 and 8. And so 7 and 8, while Ethan in the Winters stuff is completely kind of fallen away from the main story, I still know that they are going to bring up remnants of those stories. Evelyn, if that's a main anchor here for this game, that goes right back into 7. So in this trilogy of games, you have 9 going right back to 7, which is appropriate in a, trilogy. It always goes back to the first one in said trilogy timeline. They don't want to abandon the Megamycete just yet, which, am I a big fan of the Megamycete? Not really. I mean, it was okay how they did it in 7 and 8, but I just don't want to be fighting, what we were fighting in Resident Evil Village, basically. So I don't think that I'm completely against the Megamycete as long as they do something different, which it looks like they're doing here from what I'm reading. So let's move on here. It says, so they're creating clones of Evelyn with the Megamycete. Chris and Barry will be supporting Jill and Leon via radio calls. One mentions Rosemary Winters. So they're still mentioning Rosemary Winters because at this point, again, this is before Shadows of Rose, so Rose is still relevant in some way. She's not going to be in this game, it doesn't seem like, but they may mention her. And it looks like Chris and Barry supporting them via radio calls, which means they're not necessarily going to be on the front line, so to speak. They may just be kind of in the background. Maybe they'll come in towards the end if they need help. It says right here, apparently, now again, like I said, this does get into spoiler territory, so you have been warned. Jill and Leon will be infected with the Megamycete. So, like any true infection story, you have to infect your main characters with the Megamycete. And I do think that it's interesting because, them getting infected with the Megamycete, what happens, right? I mean, we figured out that Ethan was, dead since Resident Evil 7, and he was the molded in Resident Evil 8, and we find this out after the fact. But how is that going to look with Jill and Leon? And how is that going to affect Jill with her current state of, having been infected with a virus before? Is that going to affect her more? Is that going to slow down her infection? Is that going to be in her benefit? I'm curious to see how this also affects Leon as well. But yes, I mean, there's always a, storyline where somebody gets infected and you have to find the cure. So that does kind of, fall in line with Resident Evil isms, if you want to call them that. Blue Umbrella will return, which is very interesting because that was, the Umbrella company that Chris was apparently working for in Resident Evil 7, and then they completely kind of went by the wayside in Resident Evil 8 about that. But apparently they're coming back, so Umbrella is back in another entity. I even said back then, why would Chris work for anything named Umbrella? But it does really seem like that was a plot point that they completely abandoned because by Resident Evil Village, he had his own squad and he was part of the, Hound Wolf squad. So it was very different with how they pivoted away from those story elements. But apparently, Blue Umbrella is coming back. I'm sure Chris is not with them at this point, but I'm curious to see how this manages the whole, what happened with BSAA at the end of Village? Why were they sending in BOWs? Is this going to go into that? I certainly hope so. I mean, Jill is still with BSAA, so what does that say about all this stuff? The island, so again, this takes place on an island. The island location consists of an abandoned hospital, caves, abandoned houses, dark forest, abandoned factory, laboratory, and a temple. So as far as the island setting, I mean, I don't hate islands. I think islands are kind of like a staple in Resident Evil, as long as the designs are really good and they're creepy, and it's better than the Romanian-esque village that we got in Resident Evil 8. I think I will be happy with what they do here. This may be one of the last RE games in the RE engine before they move on to the Rex engine. But I don't even know what engine this may be on. But if they've already been developing this, I'm sure it is on the RE engine. So this may be, a last little, piece of the RE engine that we're going to see that's really pushing a lot of these, boundaries of the engine and really making this as good as possible. So I'm excited to see that. So let's get into some of the, enemies and stuff like that. Because I think that's the one thing that we really wanted to know was that, what's going to happen with some of these enemies. How are they going to evolve from what we saw in 7 and 8? I wasn't a fan of the molded in 7. I wasn't a fan of the enemies in 8 either with the Megamycete infections. So let's see what's going on here. So the main enemies will be evolved zombies, similar to Ganados in Resident Evil 4, as they can also use melee weapons. So very interesting point that melee weapons and zombies being, kind of more enhanced. So basically, Ganados from Resident Evil 4, it seems like Resident Evil 4 enemies always have kind of stuck with people. People kind of you either like them or you don't like them, right? It's always been that way. You're either somebody who likes the flesh-eating zombies, or a lot of people are fans of the Ganados from Resident Evil 4, which again, I like both. I would have liked them to maybe go back to some zombies, but it seems like if this is kind of leaning in a more action kind of element, they're going to keep enemies like Resident Evil 4 with those Ganados. So not completely disappointed by that, as long as, again, they kind of have some kind of memorable impact. It's very hard to beat the Ganados as far as how impactful and memorable they were, because it was the first time we saw anything like that in the Resident Evil franchise. So that is something that, is going to be apparently the enemies. They worship the moon and have moon tattoos on their arms. They can be heard singing to the moon while looking out to the sea. So this whole kind of moon, worship, and a lot of people were talking the earlier leaks about witches and lichens and all that shit. Again, that was not the case. That seems like those leaks are false, which I'm happy, because I was not really looking forward to seeing that kind of stuff and Wendigos and all that shit. That is not Resident Evil, in my opinion. That does not feel like Resident Evil. I think if you have another Ganado-esque cult that is, worshiping the moon for whatever reason, or, kind of singing to the moon, so to speak, that's very interesting. That does kind of intrigue me. I'm curious to see how this is going to, kind of play into that. It says Leon will be stalked by a constant enemy, while Jill will be attacked by the Goat Man. I don't know what the hell the Goat Man is. It doesn't say which enemy Leon will be stalked by either, but it looks like they will both have different enemies that attack them. So I'm curious how this is going to play out, because the way that this is reading, it seems like you play as Leon for a little bit and then you play as Jill for a little bit. So I'm curious how they're going to balance that in, and both of them are going to obviously offer different features. I'm sure Leon and Jill have different physical abilities that they can, melee attack with, counter attack with. I'm wondering if they're going to keep the parry system from Resident Evil 4 Remake, where you just, hit off throwing projectiles and dodge certain enemies. I think that does kind of make sense. What if they had Jill's dodging system from Resident Evil 3 Remake, and then we had Leon's parry system for Resident Evil 4 Remake? That would be awesome. That actually would be a really cool difference within characters, So it says the antagonist here is called Mr. Simon. So Mr. Simon is apparently the antagonist here. Who is Mr. Simon? Not sure, but apparently he's trying to clone a bunch of Evelyns on an island, and, in a very Resident Evil-esque fashion. So I'm curious to see what's going to happen with this Mr. Simon, how they're going to make him a memorable villain. It's always hard to live in the shadow of Wesker, because every villain forever will always be compared to Albert Wesker. And I feel like 7 and 8 had very, I guess, weaker villains. The Bakers in 7 were a lot better than the House Leaders in 8, in my opinion. But as far as a single person villain, right? We haven't really had that in a little while that was really memorable. So I'm curious to see how Mr. Simon is going to play up with our past Resident Evil villains. And it says here, playtests were held in April and September. So that does kind of make sense. This year might have just been a big cycle of development for Resident Evil, and they wanted to test it in a few different quarters of the year. It says April playtest apparently was a Jill section in the abandoned hospital, while the September playtest included Leon in the forest. So again, 2 main characters, 2 different sections of the game. Maybe there is a part where maybe Jill gets infected and then Leon has to take over, vice versa. I'm curious to see how they're going to balance that out, but I am very happy to see Leon and Jill in a game together. It was one thing to see it in Death Island, and of course, fans had their, things to say about Death Island. Some people really just weren't a fan of it, how they brought them together. Some people were. I liked it. I thought it was a really good film, but to be able to play these characters in a game together where it's in, this kind of continuation of 7 and 8, and we're finally getting our main characters as we know it in these games, I think this will be a really hyped up game, because once people start seeing the teaser trailers and the promotional posters with Leon and Jill on it, and Chris and Barry and all the above, I mean, that's hype right there. That's how you hype up a game. So that's really cool. It says Resident Evil 9 will close the Resident Evil 7 and Village story with the Mega Mice seat. So that makes sense. Any trilogy you have, typically you always try to close it out appropriately. Now, in the regards of 4, 5, and 6, 5 definitely connected with 4, but 6 really did feel kind of more of like an outcasty type story and game. And it didn't really feel like it completely wrapped everything up because there was so much going on. Where 7 and 8 did kind of feel a little bit more contained. 8 got a little out there. If 9 is able to, kind of wrap up these, Mega Mice seat strategies that they're trying to implement everywhere, infect everything, have this Evelyn infect all of these homes and places throughout the United States and the world, rather. I'm curious to see how they're going to wrap all of this stuff up. And this does kind of seem more accurate because, like I said, playtests have happened before. And it does seem to take place a couple times a year with some of these games. And a lot of times they get feedback for this year and they focus on next year. Now, the only logical thing for this year, for this thing to be shown, is if they showed something at a Game Awards for 2024. I wouldn't put it past them, but I'm not sure if that's going to be the case. We may get a reveal next year and then get a release date for next year. Capcom always keeps things under wraps. But as far as what I'm reading here, like my general thoughts, I think this looks pretty damn good. It seems like it's going to have the action vibe that Resident Evil 4 Remake had, that Resident Evil Village had, you know what I mean? I'm sure there'll be some kind of horror elements thrown in there, but it does look like it's sticking with a action route. So, which isn't bad. Again, if you liked Resident Evil 4 Remake or Village, you'll probably like this game. This does seem like it's going to be the best one out of the trilogy of 7, 8, 9, in my opinion. I mean, Jill's is my favorite Resident Evil character, is my favorite video game character of all time, so you already have me sold there. And the fact that she's teaming up with Leon, and Leon's a part of the story as well, I don't mind the fact that we kind of swap between these two characters and they have a storyline going in together. I think that's really cool. I think it's going to be really cool to see them in a video game capacity where Death Island was just in an hour-and-a-half movie. So I do like the CGI movies, don't get me wrong, but playing as them together, working together, or even if it's in separate sections, does have me very intrigued to see how it's going to all unfold and how they're going to interact, and the dialogue, the banter they have with each other. Not to mention Chris and Barry, even if they are in the background for this, or they're kind of through radio calls, or they come in towards the end maybe in some cutscenes, seeing all of them interact will be a big treat for fans. So let me know what you think of these leaks. Again, it comes from a credible source. Shout out to Andy from Biohazard Declassified, and obviously the playtester who remains to be unnamed. As, like I mentioned before, a lot of these playtesters stay anonymous for that reason, because they are, leaking out this information, of course. And we did the same thing with the person that we knew back in the Village days. So Same thing with a lot of, different play tests that happen. They always do multiple play tests, and it really is a strict, like, you cannot mention this stuff, but it always gets out to somebody. So this is definitely the most accurate leaks that we've gotten this whole time. There was a lot of, like, running around aimlessly, wondering what was real, what wasn't. And it seems like we're finally getting closer to some solid evidence of what this game actually will be. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe. Let me know again in the comments how you feel about all of these leaks down below. And stay tuned for more Resident Evil content covering these leaks as we get more leaks or more reveals or information and all that good stuff. And I'll catch all of you in the next one. Take care.